Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine matters of public interest. And today we'll be looking at violent crime, and that is certainly a matter that affects most Guyanese and has affected most Guyanese for several decades. And the big question that we ask ourselves is whether Guyana is a violent country. And when you look at the reports of crime, I mean, maybe they fluctuate from year to year, but we had about 1,533 cases of violent crime last year, 2022. Every week, there are two murders in Guyana, well, more than two murders on average, given the 52 weeks. And every week, 5 women are raped in this country. Small country of Guyana, every week, 5 women are raped. You can see what happens at the end of the year. You're talking about, over 250 women being raped in a year. This is terrible. This is an outrage, and it's very unsafe for all citizens, and particularly for women. And in fact, only a fraction of crime can be measured. A lot of crime is undetected. A lot of crime is unreported, maybe because the victims don't care to report it. And a lot of crime is unrecorded. So even though I point out that 5 women are raped every week, those are reports. The figure might be much higher. So we have a serious situation in the country. And all of us, citizens, because we are the ones who are likely to be vulnerable to crime, we are the ones who are most likely to be victims. Every citizen needs to be concerned about making Guyana a safer place, particularly the women, so that children can grow up in safety and dignity. Violent crime still persists in Guyana, and you may be surprised to learn that the per capita murder rate in Guyana is higher than that of the United States. And the per capita murder rate is higher than the United States. And in fact, the United States Department of State issued an advisory urging its citizens to exercise caution when visiting this country. That is because of the high crime rate. Violent crime, of course, has consequences. And as a result, one of the results is that Guyana has one of the world's highest emigration rates of skilled personnel. This is not a political issue which party is in office. Guyana has one of the highest emigration rates in the world, maybe over 89% of skilled persons emigrating, and that is why perhaps so much attention is paid to the diaspora. But many people in the diaspora know why they're not in Guyana, and those of us who are in Guyana must make the country safer, so that our skilled persons, our university graduates, and ordinary workers will be inclined to stay. But they will only stay if they're safe. When we speak about violent crime, we're speaking about mostly physical harm. We're speaking about assault. We're speaking about gun and knife crimes. We're speaking about alcohol-related or drug-related violence. We're speaking about gang violence. We're speaking about manslaughter and murder. And worst of all, we're speaking about rape of women. And crime is most prevalent in the heavily populated regions, the coastal regions, particularly Region 4, Demerara, Mahaica, Region 5, Mahaica, Berbice, and Region 6, East Berbice, Quarantine. Those are the most heavily populated regions, and yes, we have the heaviest rate of crime. At least when you look at the other regions, in the hinterland, particularly Region 1, that's Barima Waini, where we have about 36,000 Venezuelan migrants. Region 7, the Cuyuni Mazruni, which has a long border with the Venezuelans. where a lot of the gangs, enter at will. Region 8, the Patara Separuni, and Region 9, the Rupununi, which has a 1,300 kilometer border. Here in these four hinterland regions, we have a very high crime rate as well. So it is not confined to the coast, it's not confined to a few areas. You can almost say that violent crime, is a countrywide phenomenon. And year by year, we know the police publish statistics, but those of us who live in the countryside, those in rural areas in the hinterland, know that serious crime is really, unbearable at this stage for a country of our size and a country with our aspirations to become a developed state. What are the causes of crime? Well, from country to country, the causes may differ. In Guyana, I think there are social and economic and sometimes political issues. The low level of education is one factor, and it is hoped that more educated persons or persons who are able to complete their primary and secondary school and tertiary education would be less involved in violent crime. There's a high unemployment rate. This is not to be blamed only on COVID. This is a persistently high rate, particularly about young people. And young people coming out of school who have not been able to get their school certificates are finding it difficult to get jobs. And that's why our coalition administration actually created the Youth Corps, so that young people could be trained to get jobs. But high unemployment is a contributory factor. Young people are hungry. And I'm not saying that hungry people are criminals, but there is a tendency for unemployed young people to become involved in crime. And when you look at the imprisonment rate, it tells a story that over 60% of the inmates, the convicts in our four prisons are actually classified as young. And then there's the inequality. We've pointed this out before. There's growing inequality in Guyana. Some people use strong words, but there is a clear indication that the hinterland is relatively poorer than the coastland. I normally use the term, Guyana west of Fort Island, but those of us who travel west of Fort Island into regions 1, 7, 8, and 9 would see that there is extreme poverty in some areas and relative poverty in other areas. And the two parts of Guyana, east and west of Essequibo, are unequal. That's a fact. And when we consider infrastructure, we need to get a bridge across the Essequibo River. We need to deliver services to Western Guyana. And that's one of the reasons why my administration created tongues in Bartica, Mabaruma, Madia, and Lethem, so that these tongues, with their mayors and the tongue councils, would help to trigger economic development. But still, there's inequality. And sometimes you can have unstable social conditions. Sometimes families break up. And when this happens, many children suffer. They end up on the street. They end up without jobs because daddy and mommy are not living together anymore. So we need to look at family stability, because many children cannot survive without families. So when families break up, the children suffer most. The adults go their own ways, but the children have nowhere to go, except perhaps on the street. Hinterland, I mentioned a minute ago, is an area of concern. West of Fort Island, there is an increasing number of cases of violent crime. In 2020, we had 568 cases of violent crime, 51 murders, 51 murders, in the hinterland alone, regions 1, 7, 8, and 9. The next year, 2021, there were 612 cases of violent crime, 59 murders. The murder rate is going up in the hinterland. Many people in the coastline call it the bush. Well, the bush could be a very violent place. And last year, it has gone up to 66 murders. So year by year, the rate of murder and also other forms of violent crime, these rates have been increasing in the hinterland. In addition to that, my friends, we have a long border, nearly 800 kilometers with Venezuela, and sometimes, some of the unruly gangs called sindicatos. Uh, I don't think the gang's name is sindicato, but sindicatos are the groups, the gangs of people who come together. Rob Guyanese, and they come into our territory, the rob gold miners, and hardly a month passes that there's not some robbery on the Cuyuni River, which forms the border between Venezuela and Guyana in the west. And this is an area in Region 7 particularly, this is an area in which the Venezuelan sindicatos have been wreaking havoc on our Guyanese. And that is why we've always called, at least my administration called for greater deployment of the army and police on our borders to protect our citizens, not Mandela Avenue, on the borders of Guyana. That's where the syndicatos attack. That's where the police must be deployed. That's why we created new police divisions. There used to be one hinterland division. Those of you who are the old timers would remember people talk about F division. Now we have 4 divisions with 4 senior commanders in the Barima Waini, in the Cuyuni Mazruni, in the Pomeroon Supinam, and in the Rupununi. And that is where we need, heavier police deployment and military deployment, not Mandela Avenue. We need them on our borders to protect our citizens who are subject to attack, who are victims of attack by Venezuelan sindicatos. That is an important consideration for the commanders of these 2 important forces. The role is to secure our borders and protect our citizens from violent crime. And right now, the violent crime in the hinterland is unacceptably high. My friends, some time ago, I agree that the report may not be up to date, but United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and the World Bank, they provided a report, and they stated that crime in the Caribbean, including Guyana, is unbearably high. This is a question of the rate of this small region, small population in comparison to the world. The UNODC and World Bank indicated that narco trafficking was at the heart, at the core of the murder rate in the Caribbean. And they said the murder rate in the Caribbean, this small collection of micro-states, is higher than any other region in the world. This is bad news. And Guyana is part of that tragic statistic that the murder rate in our country and in the Caribbean is being inflated by narcotics trafficking. Some people think that narcotics trafficking is a way to get money without going to the bank. It's a way to help the cash flow of struggling businesses, and that the drugs are just, particularly cocaine, they're just for export. We don't keep the drugs here. But unfortunately, people who are in narco trafficking bring in guns. They bring in guns to enforce their trade and to expand their territory. And this is what we saw during the troubles between 2000 and 2010 or thereabouts. Once you have drugs, you're going to have guns. Once you have guns, people are going to use the guns. And you're going to have violent crime. And according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, narco trafficking is one of the factors driving violent crime in the Caribbean. And they warn also, these 2 institutions warn also that uh, narco trafficking is normalizing illegal behavior and diverting criminal justice resources away from other important activities. So people have to pay, or the organizations have to pay more attention to stamping out drug trafficking when they should be paying attention to protecting the people in other areas. What we have found over the years, particularly since the start of this century under the PPP administration in 2021, we have found that narco trafficking has been embedding violence and undermining social cohesion. And it also contributes to widespread availability of firearms. And this is a big problem in Guyana. You see the linkage: drugs, uh, collapse of social cohesion, and availability of firearms. This brings us to gun crimes. Guyana has the highest number of gun owners in the Anglophone Caribbean. Why? Sometimes you go down the street and you pass some enterprises and you see guards with massive guns. And many of the guns in this country, well, Guyana doesn't manufacture guns. Many of the guns in this country, many of the firearms, come from Brazil, across the border. Many of them are illegal, and of course, from the United States. So Guyana is overgunned. And as a result of that, there are more gun crimes. And of course, drug traffickers use guns to enforce, the drug trade and to protect the drug trade. And this is out of control as well. Again, international organizations estimate that there are about 122,000 firearms in the hands of civilians. Now, when you consider that there are probably 750,000 civilians, maybe some of them, some persons have more than one firearm, but the ratio is very high. And once you have those guns, they're going to be used for illegal purposes. This is one of the reasons why we need the army and the police on the borders and not in Mandela Avenue, so they could stop illegal weapons and illegal drugs from entering this country. Because the drugs and the weapons together help to drive up violent crime in Guyana. We know that when the APNU-FC coalition was in office, violent crime was being brought under control. Piracy was almost entirely eradicated from Guyana's waters. We introduced, or we supported, the National Drug Strategy Master Plan, which was being, it's gone through various permutations over the years since President Hoyt's time. It used to be called National Drug Law Enforcement Committee, used to be in charge of that plan, but now it ought to have been adopted. It certainly was adopted by my administration between 2015 and 2020. And in the form of a National Drug Strategy Master Plan. I also established something called the National Anti-Narcotics Agency, NANA. And of course, as soon as the PPP got into office in August 2020, well, not as soon, the next month, they just abolished the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. Why would they want to do that? Well, drug trafficking is still out of control. That was the consequence of abolishing the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. And then, of course, my administration introduced the Security Sector Reform Plan. And we actually had experts from United Kingdom, funded by United Kingdom, to outline that plan. So when the PPP entered office in August 2020, they inherited a plan. When they were in office, they rejected the plan. I remember it was over £3 million sterling. And the defense secretary, or in fact what is called the head of the presidential secretariat, on the instructions of the government, turned down the plan. So when the APNUFC coalition got in, we re-engaged the United Kingdom government, and we did have a plan. And the plan was passed on to the present administration. And of course, we introduced also the security, well, in fact, the social cohesion action plan. As you know, the very first year that we were in office, we embarked on this plan for social cohesion. This is because every Guyanese person knows that there is a social cohesion problem. What do you want to call it? Racial disunity, whatever it is. There is a problem of social cohesion. And in year one, the APNU AFC coalition introduced the Social Cohesion Action Plan. Um, and after that, we introduced the Guyana Youth Corps. Why? In order to provide training for young people. And we supported the Youth Entrepreneurial Skills Training Program, YEST, so that young people could get training for jobs. We could reduce the number of NEETs, the NEETs, the persons not in employment, education, or training, NEET. And that is why the Youth Corps, and of course the PPP, once it entered office, abolished the Youth Corps. So there are a lot more unemployed young people. There's no point giving them hampers every month. There's no point giving them cutlasses and tell them clean up some street corner. People need dignified employment. And this is what the government needs to pay attention. And it may seem like a small matter, but 10 months after the APNU AFC coalition entered office, it held local government elections. We entered office in May 2015, and by March 2016, we had local government elections. And 2 years later, in 2018, we had local government elections again, twice. The PPP has been in office since August 2020 and hasn't been able to hold local government elections. They're still kicking the can down the road. Local government are elections because they are a part of inclusionary democracy promised under Article 13 of our Constitution. It helps people at the neighborhood level, community level, to be involved in decision making. Whoever wins the neighborhood, whether it's APNU or AFC or PPP, local government elections are an important part of decision making. So what has happened is that in entering office, the PPP has dismantled, many of the institutions which were erected by the APNU AFC to reduce criminal violence. They ignored and disregarded the National Drug Strategy Master Plan. They abolished the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. They have failed to implement the security sector reform plan. They have rejected the Social Cohesion Action Plan. They've dismantled the Guyana Youth Corps. They have abandoned the Youth Entrepreneurial Skills Training Program, and they haven't held local government elections. The result, my friends, is that violent crime is thriving in this atmosphere of, I would say, tolerance. Because many of the structures and institutions which were established to reduce crime have been removed. And therefore, the factors which used to inhibit violent crime have been removed, and violent crime is starting to increase all over again. That is the result of of the actions by our administration since August 2020. My friends, we know about the laws, we know about the Criminal Law Act, we know about Public Order Act and all, Evidence Act and all that. We cannot blame the laws. The laws are important, yes. they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. Laws have to be enforced. And legislation on its own cannot reduce the impact of violence. It cannot restore lives and households which have been lacerated by violence. It cannot be repair broken homes. Laws can punish afterwards, but they cannot, without an examination of the causes of the crime, eradicate the scourge of violent crime. And of course, the secondary impact of domestic violence. The secondary impact, my friends, the children who going to school who were 3 or 4 years old in 2020, in 2003, are now 24 years old. They're no longer nursery school children going to school, seeing a dead body here, seeing a body floating in the trench. They're now young adults in their 20s. And they grew up with bullet holes in their walls. They grew up hearing gunshots at night. And these memories are still with them. There is a secondary impact of children who, in their early formative years, witness or are subject to violence. When they grow up and they themselves become young adults, well, they're influenced by what they learn in childhood. And that is one of the contributory factors to violent crime. The secondary impact. The immediate impact, the first impact, is what happens to the victim, the shooting. But the secondary impact is what happens to the witnesses and the families which have been torn apart by violence. So legislation is necessary. We have legislation, but what is necessary is not always sufficient. We need to do more in terms of enforcement. The question facing us now is, how do we move forward? What is the way forward? And in this regard, we need to look not only at the loss of human life as a result of criminal violence, of homicide, of suicides. We have to look at the emotional stress. We have to look at the social and economic costs to victims' families and to society as a whole. And let me say this, violent crime increases the risk of mental health problems. So when you see a lot of madi people, it is not that they're stupid, it's that they're living in violent circumstances, sometimes criminally violent circumstances. It not only compromises the well-being of its victims, but it also compromises the mental health of society. The consequences of the violent crimes perpetrated during what we call the disturbances in the mid-1960s, particularly 1964, when the PPP launched that horrible hurricane of protest in an effort to stop the elections in 1964. And then the troubles, again under the PPP administration in the early 2000s, those consequences are still evident in present-day society. And it is my considered opinion that violent crime is the greatest impediment to human safety and social cohesion. Living in a peaceful environment is not a privilege, it is an entitlement. And our children, Guyana's children, have an absolute right to grow up in a country that is safe. Thank you, and may God bless you.